Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I have a very special pleasure today to talk to a fellow YouTuber, Alexander Mercouris, who is one of the hosts of the Duran channel. The link will be below, where he and his colleague, 𝗟𝗟𝗧𝗏𝘂𝘁𝗂𝘁𝗍, analyze geopolitics, especially the war in Ukraine, but beyond that, also topics of world politics in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Alexander is a trained lawyer, and he dissects his research topics with intellectual rigor and precision, which I really admire. I watch their channel almost daily, so it's a great pleasure talking to you, Alexander. Thank you for coming online.
Well, it's a very great pleasure to be here, Pascal, and thank you for your very kind words.
Alexander, I would really like to start first with your work. So the Duran. What is a Duran? Why did you pick that name?
I didn't pick the name. It was picked by my colleague, 𝗟𝗟𝗧𝗏𝘂𝘁𝗂𝘁𝗍. We are a team of two on the Duran. We have our individual channels, but we have our main channel, which is the Duran. He picked the name, and he has to this day he's never disclosed to me either how he came across it or what he exactly intended by it. But I will say a few things which he has shared with me, which is that it's derived from Latin, ultimately, and it's about firmness and integrity, and it's the kind of it's the root you find. It's the same root as in words like durability, for example, and it gives that kind of quality. So that's why he came across it, but it's his little secret that he keeps even from me.
Well, it's good to have secrets. Let me ask you another thing, which is some of the things that I admire about your work is that you're going through a lot of source material, obviously, in order to give the level of details that you try to provide in these various topics. How much time do you spend approximately per day for your research?
Oh, many hours. I usually spend several hours in the morning reading through various pieces, independent media pieces, listening to what people have to say. I mean, going to YouTubers like yourself. But of course, I also read the mainstream media, and I also do something which I think is unusual, which is I go directly to the source in the sense of what the governments themselves say. So the readouts that the various foreign ministries come up with when meetings take place, the statements that they take place. And if it's always important when there is a meeting between, let us say, President Biden and Xi Jinping to look at what both governments are saying, because the two governments might be giving a quite different account of the same meeting. So it can take hours. And of course, on a particularly heavy news day, then it will take even more hours. But it's a long, complex, difficult process, and it's at the same time a very, very interesting one. You see almost, if you like, history in the making. You see things evolving and changing, and you see how governments try to argue their positions, and ultimately you get a feel for what the policies are and what the people who are running them are like.
We have this problem that the mainstream news is basically flooded with very uniform analysis, not to say propaganda, and your channel is one of those that kind of does what you just said, like you go and analyze the sources and try then to make sense, which is why people find so much value in your work. How do you decide when you trust a source, or how do you approach critical reading? How do you do it?
Yeah, it's time. I mean, time is an absolutely vital thing. So you read somebody, you listen to somebody, and then gradually, as you see the work of this person evolve, you gradually decide, well, this is somebody you can trust. Now, of course, there are different types of people that I read. I read people who are on-the-spot reporters, and if they go about their reporting in a very over-emotional way, they're talking more about themselves and their feelings, which you often find, well, you know immediately that that isn't a source to be trusted. If they are intermingling a lot of opinion commentary with the reports, again, you don't know what to be but you don't know. You know when not to trust them. But if they're simply being factual, well, that tells you something. And if they're being factual about things they've seen and heard themselves, then if they're doing reporting, then again, you can trust them still more. Now, the more complicated and difficult is to look at commentary, opinion commentary. And here the question is trust. I mean, do you trust a person to be true to themselves, to their opinions, or in the way in which they carry out their analysis? Now, if it's the second, then language is extremely important. If somebody is using manipulative and mendacious language, and you said that I'm trained as a lawyer, it's something that as a lawyer you learn to see. So if the language is very twisted, if the person is saying one thing and implying another, or alternatively, if they're doing things like giving you the impression that they're saying something and actually falling just short of saying it, then of course you know that this is somebody that you must be extremely careful of. Though the very fact that can sometimes also be interesting in themselves, because if it's a government doing that, and it often is, by the way, then that is particularly interesting. You know that that government is out to deceive you, which, by the way, is something which all governments without exception, at some point do.
Some of your critics keep saying that you're a Putin puppet and whatnot, the usual thing. It's just, I think it's worth pointing out that you wouldn't recommend trusting what the Kremlin says neither, right?
Absolutely, of course not. I mean, the Kremlin gives readouts, and it's extremely productive in producing readouts and commentaries and things of that kind. But the Kremlin lies, like all governments lie. It is always trying to argue its case, as it would say. But of course, governments are not held to account for their lies in the way that people are. So, of course, the Kremlin lies, and you have to take that into account as well. Now, of course, the people who say that, I'm a Putin puppet, obviously are either not listening to what I'm saying every day, or alternatively, they are listening to what I'm saying, and it is not in accordance with their particular policies and their particular lies. One has to use that word, over specifically this issue of Ukraine, but of other things too. And of course, that is what is shaping their commentary. But to stress again, I am completely independent of Putin. I can be quite critical of him sometimes. I can be quite critical of everybody. And always, one needs to maintain skepticism over what every government says.
I can only second that this is the right approach for anyone who wants to do their own analysis. And the fascinating thing is that the people who don't like that, they will always try to tell you that these are the forbidden people. You're not allowed to listen to them, because if you do, you will be deceived and you're too stupid. Therefore, you will immediately fall for their lies. That's what the people who try to be very dishonest in their approach.
Absolutely. What they'll also say is that you must trust me, because my intentions are so perfect and so wonderful that you cannot possibly compare my opinions, my statements, what we're saying to what the other side is saying, who are bad, deceitful, corrupt people. And when a government does that, by the way, when they talk in that way, then you should be particularly careful not to trust what they're saying, because that's an example of manipulative language.
Now we've got people like you, but also the Gray Zone, Glenn Greenwald, Jimmy Dore, who do fantastic work on current affairs of giving analysis. On the other hand, the mainstream is getting mainstreamier with every year. Overall, are you rather optimistic about the media landscape, including new media like YouTube and Rumble and so on, or are you pessimistic about what's going to come in the future?
I'm very pessimistic about legacy media, about the old journals, the big newspapers, which we all used to read once upon a time, Le Monde, The Guardian. I mean, I can barely bring myself to read Le Monde anymore, by the way. I used to follow it continuously. But those sorts of places, and the big television channels, I'm afraid they're not only becoming more mainstream, they're becoming more like each other. I mean, they're basically saying the same talking points. They're reporting the same things from the same perspective, and they're becoming increasingly aggressive and intolerant to everybody else. But at the same time, there is a flourishing and developing and constantly evolving and constantly growing independent media out there. Now, what happened is that certain governments, and again, all governments do this to some extent, but certain governments in particular in the West have influence over social media companies, and they tried to restrict the spread of independent media. And of course, the mainstream, the legacy media joined in because, they don't really like rivals. But it's, I think, proving increasingly difficult to do that. People are always able to find a way around, and always people want to get closer to the truth. They're dissatisfied with these monolithic explanations that they're continuously being given. And I think if you see that, and you see how it's evolving and growing and developing despite all the problems and all the challenges, then I think one is optimistic, and I am absolutely an optimist.